History, as it is commonly told, feels solid and complete. Dates align neatly. Names are fixed in textbooks. Events unfold with the confidence of certainty. Yet beneath this polished surface, there is often a faint, persistent whisper, a suggestion that something vital has been left out. Not erased entirely, but softened, simplified, or quietly ignored. It is within this quiet space between what is taught and what is remembered that our story begins. Imagine two legends separated by oceans, cultures, and centuries. One is ancient, cloaked in sacred mystery. The Holy Grail, an object so revered that kings went to war over it. Monks died protecting its secret, and entire belief systems reshaped themselves around its meaning. The other is deeply rooted in the birth of America. Pocahontas, remembered as a gentle bridge between worlds, a symbol of peace, sacrifice, and tragic innocence. In official history, these two narratives never touch. They exist in entirely different chapters of the human story. And yet, what if this separation is an illusion? What if the Holy Grail was never meant to remain in Europe? What if its secret did not vanish with medieval knights or dissolve into myth, but instead crossed the ocean, quietly woven into the foundations of the New World? And what if Pocahontas, far from being a simple historical footnote, stood unknowingly at the crossroads of one of history's most carefully guarded bloodlines? These questions are uncomfortable. They challenge the comforting idea that history is complete, settled, and closed. They suggest that the past is not merely something behind us, but something alive, shaping identities, power, and belief in ways we rarely question. This is not the kind of history taught in classrooms. It is the kind whispered in footnotes, hidden in symbols, and buried within genealogies that seem, at first glance, entirely unremarkable. The Holy Grail itself is one of the most misunderstood symbols in human civilization. Popular culture presents it as a golden cup, a relic chased by crusaders and adventurers. But for centuries, esoteric traditions have hinted at something far more profound. They speak not of an object, but of a lineage, not a vessel of stone or metal, but a vessel of blood. A living inheritance passed quietly from generation to generation, protected not by armies, but by secrecy. Now consider Pocahontas. Her story, too, has been carefully shaped. She is remembered as a child who saved an Englishman, embraced Christianity, married into colonial society, and died young in a foreign land. But behind this simplified narrative lies a far more complex reality. She was born into indigenous nobility, daughter of a powerful leader, raised within a spiritual worldview older than Europe itself. Her life was shaped by forces far larger than personal choice, forces political, cultural, and perhaps even symbolic. When these two legends are placed side by side, something curious happens. Patterns begin to emerge. Not obvious connections, but subtle echoes. Themes of sacred inheritance, of displacement and migration, of survival through adaptation rather than conquest, of old worlds collapsing while new ones quietly take their place. History rarely moves in straight lines. It moves in currents, some visible, others hidden beneath the surface. Empires rise and fall, but bloodlines persist. Beliefs evolve, but symbols remain. What we call coincidence often appears, upon closer inspection, as design obscured by time. This documentary does not claim certainty. It does not demand belief. Instead, it invites contemplation. It asks you to slow down, to listen not only to what history says loudly, but to what it murmurs when no one is paying attention. Because suppressed history does not disappear. It waits. Throughout time, those who held power understood one simple truth: control the story, and you control reality. This is why certain narratives are preserved while others are dismissed as myth. It is why symbols are stripped of their deeper meanings and repackaged in a harmless folklore. And it is why the idea of a sacred bloodline, one that exists outside institutions, churches, and crowns, has always been treated as dangerous. The whisper we are following tonight is not new. It has appeared in medieval manuscripts written in code. It has surfaced in the strange obsessions of secret societies. It has lingered in royal genealogies that seem overly complicated for no apparent reason. And it has crossed oceans, adapting itself to new lands and new peoples, always just out of reach of official acknowledgement. To some, the idea that the Holy Grail could be connected to early American history sounds absurd. But history is full of such absurdities until they are no longer ignored. The New World was not discovered by accident. It was imagined long before it was reached. It was written about in allegory, hinted at in maps that should not have existed, and spoken of as a place of renewal, a land where old orders could dissolve and something new could be born. What if the journey to America was not just about gold, land, or power? What if it was also about preservation? About carrying something fragile and dangerous across the sea, away from the reach of collapsing empires and religious authorities? Pocahontas lived at a moment of convergence. The old world arrived at the shores of the new, bringing with it disease, faith, ambition, and fear. Indigenous societies stood at the edge of irreversible change. And between these worlds stood individuals whose lives became symbols rather than stories, simplified so that the deeper implications of their existence would never be questioned. This is where legends often hide their truths, not in grand declarations, but in silence, in the parts of the story that are rushed through, summarized, or left unexplored. Pocahontas' journey to England, her sudden transformation, her symbolic value to the English crown, her early death. Each of these moments raises questions that history rarely lingers on. Why did her story matter so much to European audiences? Why was she presented almost as a living emblem rather than a person? And why did her lineage continue to attract attention long after her death? As we begin this journey, it is important to understand that alternative history is not about replacing facts with fantasy. It is about widening the lens, about recognizing that history is written by human beings, flawed, biased, and often motivated by survival or control. The absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Sometimes it is evidence of intention. The Holy Grail, whether understood as a cup, a womb, or a bloodline, represents continuity. The idea that something sacred survives despite persecution, exile, and time itself. Pocahontas represents transformation, the merging of worlds, identities, and destinies. When continuity meets transformation, history changes quietly, invisibly, but permanently. Tonight, as this story unfolds slowly and carefully, there is no need to decide what is true. Instead, allow the questions to exist. Let the patterns reveal themselves at their own pace. Because the most powerful mysteries are not those that shock us, but those that feel strangely familiar, as if we have always known them, but never had the words. This is not the story of a hidden object locked away in a vault. It is the story of memory, blood, and belief moving through time like an underground river. You may fall asleep listening to it. You may forget parts of it, but somewhere beneath the surface, the whisper will remain. And once heard, it is very difficult to unhear. For centuries, the image of the Holy Grail has been fixed in the human imagination as something tangible. A cup, a chalice, a sacred vessel made of gold or stone. It appears in paintings, poems, and legends as an object resting on an altar or hidden in a lost temple, waiting to be discovered by a worthy hero. This image is comforting because it is simple. An object can be found. A relic can be possessed. A cup can be lifted, displayed, and claimed. But beneath this familiar picture lies a far older and far more unsettling interpretation, one that quietly challenges the foundations of religious authority and historical certainty. In esoteric traditions, the Grail was never meant to be understood as a physical object at all. Instead, it was a symbol, and symbols, unlike objects, are alive. They change shape across cultures and centuries, carrying meanings that adapt while their core remains hidden. When medieval mystics spoke of the Grail, They often used language that blurred the line between vessel and lineage, between container and continuity. This was not accidental. It was a form of protection. The term most often cited by those who study Hidden Grail traditions is sangreal. On the surface, it translates to Holy Grail. But broken apart, the words take on a different meaning entirely. Sang meaning blood, and real meaning royal. Royal blood, sacred blood, not an object passed from hand to hand, but a lineage passed from parent to child. A living inheritance. This idea would have been deeply dangerous in medieval Europe. If holiness resided in blood rather than in institutions, then kings ruled not by divine appointment from the church, but by ancestry. And if sacred authority flowed through human lineage, then salvation itself was no longer monopolized by priests, rituals, or buildings of stone. It lived instead within flesh and memory. Such ideas could not be spoken openly, so they were encoded. Songs became stories. Stories became legends, and legends became myths that scholars later dismissed as poetic fantasy. Yet those who knew how to read symbols understood exactly what was being preserved. The Grail stories that emerged in medieval literature are filled with strange contradictions. The Grail heals, yet wounds. It grants life, yet remains hidden. It can only be found by those who already belong to it. These contradictions make little sense if the Grail is a cup, but they make perfect sense if the Grail is a bloodline. A lineage cannot be seized by force. It cannot be stolen like gold. It survives through secrecy, marriage, migration, and time. It heals through continuity. It wounds through persecution. And it reveals itself only to those who are already connected to it. Early Christian sects, later labeled heretical, hinted at similar ideas. The Gnostics believed divine knowledge was not granted by external authority, but awakened internally. Some texts suggest that Jesus' teachings were meant to be preserved not through churches, but through people. Flesh as scripture, blood as memory. These ideas were violently suppressed as Christianity became institutionalized. One figure stands at the center of this suppressed tradition, Mary Magdalene. In official doctrine, she was reduced to a repentant sinner. In alternative traditions, she was something else entirely, a keeper of teachings, a partner, a witness, and possibly the carrier of a lineage that threatened the emerging power of Rome. Whether literal or symbolic, the idea of a sacred feminine vessel carrying divine continuity appears again and again in Grail symbolism. The Grail is often described as a womb, as a container of life, as something that cannot be approached with violence or greed. These descriptions align not with an object, but with biology, with birth, with inheritance. The Grail, in this sense, is not something you find. It is something you are born into. This interpretation helps explain why so many Grail stories end not with triumph, but with disappearance. The Grail vanishes. It ascends. It returns to secrecy, because bloodlines do not announce themselves. They survive quietly, blending into the world, adapting to new environments while preserving their core. As Europe entered periods of religious consolidation and political control, these ideas became increasingly dangerous. Monarchies and churches depended on legitimacy that flowed from above, from God to king, from God to pope. A sacred bloodline that existed independently of both was a direct threat. And so, the Grail was transformed into a harmless fantasy, a nightly quest, a moral allegory, a fairy tale. Yet symbols have memory. Even stripped of their meaning, they leave traces. The Grail appears repeatedly alongside references to exile, journey, and protection. It is guarded not by armies, but by those sworn to silence. It moves when danger rises. It disappears when power seeks to claim it. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had become increasingly hostile to anything that challenged centralized authority. The Inquisition burned texts, erased traditions, and rewrote narratives. But bloodlines could not be burned. They could only be scattered. And scattering, paradoxically, ensured survival. This is where the Grail begins to take on a global dimension. If the sacred bloodline could not remain safely in Europe, it would have to move. It would have to cross borders, cultures, and eventually oceans. Not as conqueror, but as guest. Not as ruler, but as seed. The New World, long imagined in European esoteric thought as a place of renewal, offered something Europe no longer could: distance from old powers, distance from inquisitions, distance from memory itself, a place where identities could be reshaped and lineages could disappear into the fabric of new societies. When viewed through this lens, the Grail ceases to be medieval. It becomes timeless. It becomes adaptable. It becomes something that could exist in indigenous bloodlines just as easily as in European ones, because its power does not come from geography or race, but from continuity and symbolism. This idea deeply unsettles modern thinking. We prefer history to be linear. We prefer symbols to be decorative rather than operative. We are comfortable with relics locked in museums, not ideas that move unseen through generations. The Bloodline Grail refuses to be contained. It challenges the assumption that sacred history ended long ago. And so, the question is no longer whether the Grail was real, but what kind of reality it belonged to. Was it ever meant to be found? Or was it meant to endure? As we move forward in this story, the Grail will continue to change shape. It will pass through dynasties, secret orders, migrations, and marriages. It will shed identities and adopt new ones. And eventually, it will arrive somewhere entirely unexpected, not as a chalice on an altar, but as a human life caught between worlds. To understand that moment, we must first accept a difficult idea: that the most important truths in history are often hidden not because they are false, but because they are too powerful to be spoken aloud. Long before the Holy Grail became a knight's quest or a poetic symbol, it existed in whispers surrounding a woman whose story was never allowed to fully surface. Mary Magdalene stands at the center of one of history's most carefully reshaped narratives. In official tradition, she is remembered briefly, almost uncomfortably, present at the margins of sacred events, forgiven, transformed, and then quietly set aside. But beneath this carefully edited portrayal lies a far older memory, one that early authorities worked tirelessly to suppress. In the earliest surviving texts, Mary Magdalene does not appear as a sinner redeemed, but as a witness and a keeper. She is present at moments where others flee. She understands teachings others struggle to grasp. In some apocryphal writings, she speaks with authority, explaining ideas the male disciples do not fully comprehend. These texts were later excluded, labeled dangerous, heretical, or misleading. Yet exclusion itself is often a sign of threat. The threat was not simply theological. It was symbolic. Mary Magdalene represented continuity, not just of teaching, but of presence. If divine truth could pass through her, then it did not belong solely to institutions. And if that continuity extended beyond words into lineage, then the foundations of emerging religious power were deeply unstable. In ancient cultures, bloodlines carried legitimacy. Kings ruled because of ancestry. Tribes endured because of descent. If sacred authority was inherited rather than bestowed, then power could not be centralized. It would flow quietly through families, beyond the reach of temples and thrones. This idea alone was enough to warrant erasure. Legends that survived outside official doctrine tell a different story. They speak of an urgent departure following the crucifixion, not merely an escape from grief, but from danger. These accounts describe a small group leaving the eastern Mediterranean, carrying with them not relics, but something far more fragile and valuable: a continuation, a future. Southern France becomes the focal point of this tradition. For centuries, the region preserved stories of a holy woman arriving by sea, carrying sacred knowledge, sometimes accompanied by a child. Churches were built over caves where she was said to have lived. Pilgrimages formed not because Rome commanded them, but because local memory persisted. What is striking is how these legends align with older Grail symbolism: the sacred feminine, the vessel, the womb. the protector of life rather than power. In this interpretation, Mary Magdalene is not simply associated with the Grail, she is the Grail. Or more precisely, she is the beginning of its earthly continuation. This is where history begins to blur into something more delicate. Because once lineage enters the story, proof becomes elusive by nature. Bloodlines survive by remaining unremarkable. They merge, adapt, and disappear into the background of history. They do not announce themselves. They leave behind patterns, not proclamations. In medieval Europe, these patterns were preserved in stories of noble families with strange origin myths. Lineages that claimed descent not from conquerors, but from exiles, from refugees, from those who arrived quietly and settled among local populations, eventually rising to prominence through marriage rather than force. The south of France, particularly regions like Provence and Languedoc, became centers of unusual spiritual independence. Beliefs flourished there that did not align neatly with Rome. Movements emphasized inner purity over ritual, knowledge over obedience. These communities were later targeted, destroyed, and erased from history. Their lands seized, their texts burnt. Yet again, the pattern repeats. Where alternative interpretations of sacred continuity appear, violence follows. Not because the ideas are weak, but because they undermine centralized authority. If a sacred lineage existed, it would have needed protection, not through armies, but through obscurity, through coded symbols, through alliances that appeared political on the surface but carried deeper meaning underneath. Marriage became a strategy. Migration became a shield. Over time, the descendants of this exodus would integrate into European nobility. Their blood would mingle with ruling families, not to dominate them, but to survive within them. This may explain why certain royal lines became obsessed with genealogy, purity, and descent. Blood mattered not just for power, but for preservation. The Grail legends that emerged centuries later often describe guardians rather than owners, keepers rather than rulers, knights sworn not to conquest, but to silence. These stories are less about achievement and more about restraint, a curious emphasis unless something fragile needed protection. Mary Magdalene's role, whether literal or symbolic, becomes central to this understanding. She embodies transition, from east to west, from spoken teaching to lived inheritance, from visible authority to hidden continuity. Her disappearance from official history mirrors the disappearance of the lineage itself, not gone, but concealed. It is important to understand that suppression does not always mean denial. Often, it means transformation. Mary Magdalene was not erased entirely. She was rewritten, reduced, her complexity flattened into something safe, a repentant follower rather than a foundational figure. This allowed institutions to acknowledge her existence without confronting her significance. But memory is stubborn. Even when reshaped, it leaves traces. Why did medieval artists portray her with symbols of royalty? Why was she associated with hidden knowledge, with caves, with wilderness rather than churches? Why did her story resonate so strongly in regions known for resistance to centralized religious control? These questions do not demand belief. They demand attention. As centuries passed, Europe grew increasingly dangerous for anything tied to alternative sacred narratives. Inquisitions expanded. Dissent became fatal. Lineages that carried old meanings would have had to make choices, disappear, assimilate, or move. The idea of exodus returns here, not as a single event, but as a recurring strategy. When pressure rises, continuity moves. When memory becomes dangerous, it changes language. Symbols replace names. Myths replace records. This pattern prepares us for what comes next. Because if a sacred line survived persecution in Europe, it would eventually seek distance not just from institutions, but from memory itself. And there's only one place that offered such distance: the unknown lands across the sea. The story of Mary Magdalene, then, is not confined to antiquity. It becomes a template, a model for survival, a quiet migration of meaning carried not in ships alone, but in people, in their descendants, their alliances, and their ability to adapt without forgetting. As we move forward, this exodus will take on new forms. It will leave behind monasteries, then castles, then maps, then ships. The sacred line will shed identities and adopt new ones. And eventually, it will stand at the edge of a new world, unrecognizable to those who seek it, yet fully alive. The Grail did not vanish. It learned how to travel. As the sacred line faded from open memory and slipped into the quiet currents of European history, it did not disappear. Instead, it resurfaced in an unexpected form, not through prophets or priests, but through kings. Long before medieval Europe became dominated by crown dynasties and centralized churches, a strange royal family emerged from the shadows of collapsing Rome. They ruled not with overwhelming military might, nor with the blessing of established religious authority, but with an aura of mystery that even their enemies seemed unable to fully explain. These are the Merovingians. To conventional historians, the Merovingians were simply the first kings of the Franks, a transitional dynasty bridging the fall of Rome and the rise of medieval Europe. But beneath this surface narrative lies a far more unsettling tradition, one that paints the Merovingians not as ordinary rulers, but as custodians of an ancient and sacred inheritance. Their origin story alone sets them apart. Unlike other royal houses that trace their lineage to heroic warriors or divine favor granted through conquest, the Merovingians claim descent from something far older and far stranger. Their legends speak of a mysterious being, sometimes described as a sea creature, sometimes as a divine ancestor, whose bloodline entered human history through a union that was never fully explained. Such myths were not meant to be taken literally. They were symbolic, a way of describing an origin that could not be spoken openly. In a world where legitimacy depended on ancestry, the Merovingians' power rested not on territory alone, but on blood. They were believed to possess a sacred quality inherited rather than earned. This belief shaped everything about how they ruled and how they were feared. One of the most unusual features of Merovingian kingship was their hair. Unlike later monarchs, Merovingian kings never cut their hair. Long hair was not a fashion choice. It was a symbol of sacred authority. To cut a king's hair was to strip him of legitimacy, to sever him from the source of his power. In this way, the body itself became a symbol, a living testament to lineage rather than office. This emphasis on the physical body aligns closely with the bloodline interpretation of the Holy Grail. Authority did not come from crowns, scepters, or anointment by the church. It flowed through flesh, through inheritance, through continuity. The king was not chosen. He was born. Such an idea would later become intolerable. As Christianity spread across Europe, it transformed from a persecuted belief into a centralized institution. Authority shifted from blood to doctrine, from lineage to approval by religious hierarchy. Kings were expected to rule with the church's blessing, not in quiet independence of it. The Merovingians, with their ancient legitimacy and symbolic power, represented an older model, one that could not be easily controlled. Yet for centuries they endured. Merovingian rule was marked by paradox. They were powerful, yet strangely passive. Their courts were influential, but real administrative power was often delegated. This has led historians to dismiss later Merovingian kings as weak or ineffective. But from another perspective, this apparent passivity may have been deliberate. Power, when hidden, is far harder to destroy. Behind the scenes, networks formed. Families aligned through marriage. Symbols and traditions were preserved quietly, away from public attention. The Merovingians became less visible, but no less significant. This period also saw the emergence of strange stories surrounding Merovingian blood. Tales of healing abilities, of prophetic dreams, of an almost supernatural connection to land and people. These accounts were not meant to be believed literally. They were expressions of something deeper, the idea that this bloodline carried memory, continuity, and meaning beyond ordinary inheritance. As the church grew stronger, tension increased. A dynasty whose authority did not originate from Rome posed a problem. The solution was not immediate destruction, but gradual replacement. A new family rose in influence, the Carolingians. Unlike the Merovingians, the Carolingians ruled with explicit religious endorsement. Their legitimacy flowed downward from the church, not upward from ancestry. The transition was carefully managed. The Merovingians were not massacred or publicly disgraced. Instead, they were quietly removed. Their kings were tonsured, their hair cut, and sent to monasteries. Symbolically and physically, their sacred authority was severed. Yet even this did not end the bloodline, because blood cannot be cut with scissors. The removal of the Merovingians from the throne did not erase their descendants. It scattered them. Their lineage moved into lesser, noble houses, into rural territories, into obscurity. This was not defeat. It was survival. The sacred line did what it had always done under pressure. It adapted. This moment marks a crucial shift in the Grail story. No longer associated with kingship, the sacred bloodline retreated into secrecy. Guardianship replaced rule. Silence replaced proclamation. The Grail ceased to be something displayed and became something hidden. Centuries later, stories of the Grail would re-emerge in medieval literature, often set in an imagined past. Knights would search endlessly for something they could never quite grasp. These stories were not historical records. They were echoes, memories transformed into allegory. The Merovingians, largely forgotten by the public, lived on in these echoes. Their role was no longer obvious, but was still present, encoded in symbols, rituals, and genealogies that few could read. It is no coincidence that regions once associated with Merovingian influence later became centers of Grail legend. Nor is it coincidence that these same regions often resisted centralized religious authority longer than others. Memory lingered in land and tradition even when names were forgotten. From this point forward, the sacred line would avoid visibility. It would not sit on thrones or claim crowns. Instead, it would move quietly through history, attaching itself to protectors rather than rulers. This shift sets the stage for the emergence of new guardians, not kings, but orders. The Merovingians were not the end of the Grail bloodline. They were its last public expression. What followed would be far more subtle and far more dangerous. When the Merovingian kings faded from the public stage, something essential changed in the way the sacred line survived. Power no longer announced itself through crowns or ancestry alone. It learned instead to wear armor, vows, and silence. This transformation marked the rise of a new kind of guardian, not a dynasty, but an order. And among all the orders that emerged in medieval Europe, none would become more feared, more mythologized, or more violently erased than the Knights Templar. Officially, the Templars were warrior monks, founded to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. They took vows of poverty, obedience, and chastity. They wore simple white mantles marked with a red cross. To the outside world, they appeared humble, disciplined, and devoted to faith. But beneath this outward simplicity, something far more complex was taking shape. The Templars were not merely soldiers. They were administrators, financiers, engineers, and scholars. They built fortresses, managed land, developed early banking systems, and maintained networks that stretched across Europe and the Middle East. Such influence should have required royal permission and ecclesiastical oversight. Yet the Templars answered to neither king nor bishop. They answered only to the Pope, and even that relationship was uneasy. This independence was unprecedented. It allowed the Templars to move freely, gather information, and protect secrets across borders. And secrets, more than swords, would become their true power. Almost immediately, rumors began to circulate. The Templars were said to possess forbidden knowledge. They were accused of heretical rituals, strange initiations, and hidden doctrines that deviated sharply from official Christianity. Some claimed they worshipped a mysterious head. Others whispered that they had uncovered something beneath the ruins of Jerusalem that changed them forever. These rumors were dismissed by authorities until they were not. What the Templars may have found during their early years remains one of history's deepest uncertainties. Their headquarters were built directly over the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon. Excavations were conducted in secrecy. No official records describe what was uncovered. But after these excavations, the order's character shifted. Its influence grew rapidly. Its wealth expanded beyond explanation, and its internal rituals became increasingly opaque. This is where Grail traditions intersect once again. Many later legends describe the Templars not as seekers of the Grail, but as its keepers. They are portrayed as guardians sworn to protect something sacred from misuse. Not a chalice displayed on an altar, but a truth too dangerous to reveal. In these stories, the Grail is never seized. It is preserved. If the Grail was understood as a bloodline rather than an object, the Templars' role begins to make sense. They were not knights in search of treasure. They were custodians, protectors of continuity. Their vows of poverty ensured they could not be corrupted by wealth. Their obedience ensured unity. Their secrecy ensured survival. The order's structure mirrored this purpose. Knowledge was compartmentalized. Initiates learned only what they needed to know. Inner circles existed within the broader organization. Symbols were used instead of explanations. Silence was enforced not as punishment, but as discipline. And then there is the question of why the Templars became such a threat. By the early 14th century, the political landscape of Europe had changed. Kings sought centralized control. The Church sought unquestioned authority, and the Templars stood in the way of both. They were wealthy, yet not owned. Powerful, yet not governed. Respected, yet not fully understood. When King Philip IV of France turned against the Templars, the accusations were extreme. Heresy, idol worship, blasphemy. These are not ordinary charges. They were symbolic. They suggested that the Templars possessed beliefs incompatible with institutional Christianity, beliefs dangerous enough to warrant total destruction. The arrests were swift. Confessions were extracted through torture. Records were manipulated. The order was dismantled. Leaders were executed. Property was seized. Officially, the Templars were erased. Yet once again, blood and memory proved more resilient than fire. Not all Templars were captured. Not all records were destroyed. Not all knowledge was surrendered. Ships vanished from French ports just before the arrests. Treasuries were found empty. Members disappeared into other orders, other families, other lands. And the Grail legends changed once more. After the fall of the Templars, stories of the Grail begin to emphasize loss and concealment. The Grail is no longer present. It has been taken away, hidden, removed from an unworthy world. This narrative mirrors what happened to the order itself. The guardians vanished, and so did what they guarded. But guardianship does not end with destruction. It evolves. If the sacred line survived the fall of kings by becoming an order, it would survive the fall of the order by becoming something even quieter. Not an institution, not a brotherhood, but a pattern, carried through alliances, marriages, migrations, and symbols too subtle to attract attention. The Templars' greatest strength was not their wealth or their armies. It was their understanding that survival depends on invisibility. When visibility becomes dangerous, continuity must dissolve into the background of everyday life. This is why the Templars left so little behind that can be definitively proven. Their legacy is not a record. It is a resonance. It appears in architecture that encodes meaning rather than decoration, in symbols that repeat across continents, in families whose genealogies are oddly difficult to trace. From this point forward, the Grail story becomes increasingly decentralized. There is no single guardian, no central authority. Instead, there are echoes, fragments of a once coherent tradition spread across Europe and beyond. And this scattering serves a purpose. A bloodline that survives through guardianship must never appear important. It must appear ordinary. It must merge with new cultures, adopt new identities, and shed old names. It must endure without being noticed. The Templars understood this. Their destruction was not a failure. It was a transformation. The guardianship of the sacred line passed from visible knights to invisible networks, from vows spoken aloud to silences maintained across generations. As Europe moved toward an age of exploration, colonization, and upheaval, these networks would face a familiar question: remain in a world growing increasingly hostile to hidden authority, or move once again into uncertainty? The answer, as history would soon reveal, lay across the sea. When the Knights Templar were broken and scattered, Europe entered a period of quiet rearrangement. On the surface, kings consolidated power, the Church tightened its grip on doctrine, and history appeared to move forward with renewed certainty. But beneath this apparent stability, something ancient was unraveling and reforming at the same time. The guardians were gone, the symbols were fractured, and the sacred line, no longer shielded by crowns or orders, faced its most dangerous challenge yet: survival without recognition. This moment marks what can only be described as the Great Dispersal. Unlike dramatic exiles marked by ships and declarations, this dispersal was subtle. It unfolded over generations. Families moved not as refugees, but as merchants, minor nobles, scholars, and landowners. Names changed, titles vanished, genealogies were quietly rewritten or allowed to decay. What mattered was not remembrance, but continuity. For a bloodline that had already learned the cost of visibility, exile was not a punishment. It was a strategy. Europe in the late medieval period had become hostile to anything that could not be categorized and controlled. Religious wars reshaped borders. Inquisitions turned neighbors into informants. Ideas were no longer debated, they were eliminated. In such an environment, the safest place for a sacred lineage was nowhere in particular. And so, the bloodline dissolved into the background of European society. This dispersal followed recognizable patterns. Certain families retreated from political prominence and re-emerged generations later in entirely different regions. Others abandoned titles and lands altogether, choosing obscurity over influence. Some integrated into emerging mercantile classes, where wealth moved quietly and lineage mattered less than appearances. Yet even in obscurity, memory was preserved. Not in written records, which could be seized or burned, but in symbols. Heraldry became one such vessel. Coats of arms, seemingly decorative, often encoded lineage, allegiance, and origin through animals, colors, and geometry. To the untrained eye, they were meaningless. To those who understood, they were maps. Marriage became another method of preservation. Strategic unions allowed bloodlines to survive without drawing attention. Rather than consolidating power visibly, these marriages spread it thinly, ensuring survival through diffusion rather than dominance. This is why certain genealogies appear strangely interconnected despite vast geographic distances. The sacred line, once centralized and guarded, had become decentralized and resilient. This dispersal also explains a curious phenomenon in European history: the sudden appearance of families with wealth, education, and influence, but no clear origin. They seem to arrive fully formed, without a traceable ascent. Historians often attribute this to lost records or coincidence. But coincidence rarely repeats with such precision. In reality, these families were not rising. They were re-emerging. The Grail tradition adapted alongside this dispersal. Stories became more abstract. The Grail was no longer described as something one could reach. It was hidden beyond reach, visible only through virtue, purity, or fate. These narratives served a purpose. They discouraged pursuit. They taught that seeking the Grail was futile unless one already belonged to it. At the same time, Europe's intellectual landscape was changing. Ancient texts resurfaced. Classical philosophy returned. Alchemy, astronomy, and mysticism flourished quietly at the margins of accepted knowledge. These disciplines shared a common trait. They spoke in metaphor. They protected truth through complexity. Within these circles, ideas of sacred lineage persisted, not as doctrine, but as allegory. The philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, the divine spark hidden within matter, all pointed toward continuity hidden within form. As pressure increased, the dispersal widened. Some branches of the bloodline moved north, blending into Celtic and Nordic regions where Roman authority had always been weaker. Others moved east, into regions where borders shifted too often for stable oversight. But the most significant movement was westward, toward the edge of the known world. Long before ships crossed the Atlantic, the idea of lands beyond Europe had already taken hold in imagination. These lands were spoken of not merely as places, but as possibilities. Places where old hierarchies did not yet exist, where memory itself could be reset. Maps from this period are filled with contradictions. Coastlines that should not exist, islands that appear and disappear, annotations hinting at knowledge gained before official discovery. To conventional historians, these maps are curiosities. To those studying hidden continuity, they are signals. The sacred line was not waiting to flee Europe in panic. It was preparing. Preparation, however, did not mean coordinated action. There was no council, no declaration. Dispersal ensured that no single failure could end the lineage. Some branches would perish, others would forget, but a few would endure. This is why the bloodline survival cannot be traced cleanly. It was never meant to be. The Great Dispersal also changed the nature of guardianship. No longer could a single order or family claim responsibility. Guardianship became implicit rather than explicit. It was carried in values, behaviors, and instincts rather than oaths. Silence became the highest virtue. Those who carried fragments of the lineage learned to avoid attention. They learned to appear ordinary. They learned that the greatest protection was irrelevance. And yet, at critical moments, they also learned how to act, to migrate, to merge, to preserve. By the time Europe entered the age of exploration, the sacred line was no longer identifiable as European alone. It had become something more fluid, more adaptable. Its identity was no longer bound to land, language, or crown. This fluidity made one thing possible: convergence. Because when a lineage sheds its visible identity, it becomes capable of merging with others, not through conquest, but through alliance. Not through dominance, but through continuity. This sets the stage for what comes next. As ships began to cross the Atlantic, Europe believed it was exporting civilization, faith, power, culture. But unseen among these exports was something else, a lineage that had survived collapse, persecution, and exile by learning how to disappear. The New World would not simply receive European settlers. It would receive memory. And somewhere in that convergence, between Old World survivors and ancient indigenous lineages, the sacred line would find not refuge, but transformation. The dispersal was not the end of the story. It was the opening of a new chapter, one written not in castles or cathedrals, but on unfamiliar shores, where history itself had not yet decided what it would become. As Europe edged closer to the dawn of the modern age, something subtle, yet profound, was taking place beneath the surface of politics, religion, and exploration. The old structures of power were beginning to crack. Monarchies grew paranoid. Churches tightened doctrine. Knowledge became both a currency and a threat. And within this unstable environment, a new kind of thinker emerged. One who understood that survival no longer depended on hiding in shadows alone, but on reshaping the future itself. Among these figures, one name appears again and again in alternative histories, whispered with careful ambiguity: Francis Bacon. To mainstream history, Bacon was a philosopher, a statesman, and a pioneer of the scientific method. He championed observation over dogma, experimentation over inherited belief. On the surface, he appears as a man of reason standing at the threshold of modernity. But beneath this public identity lies a second, more enigmatic figure, one entangled with symbolism, secret societies, and visions of a hidden destiny beyond Europe. Bacon lived at a time when knowledge was dangerous. Ideas that challenged religious authority could destroy careers or end lives. And yet, Bacon wrote extensively about hidden truths, coded language, and the necessity of concealment. He understood that the most powerful ideas could not survive if exposed too early. This understanding aligns closely with traditions long associated with the Grail lineage. Knowledge preserved through symbolism, continuity protected through silence, and truth revealed only when conditions allow. It is within this context that the Rosicrucians enter the story. Officially, the Rosicrucian movement emerged through mysterious manifestos published in the early 17th century. These texts spoke of a secret brotherhood dedicated to spiritual enlightenment, scientific advancement, and the transformation of society. They described members who worked invisibly within the world, guiding progress without seeking recognition. No membership lists existed. No headquarters were identified. And yet, the ideas spread rapidly across Europe. To some, the Rosicrucians were a hoax. To others, a philosophical movement. But to those studying hidden continuity, they represented something far older, a reconfiguration of guardianship for a new age. Where the Templars had used swords and fortresses, the Rosicrucians used symbols and ideas. Where knights had sworn vows, philosophers embedded truth in metaphor. The rose and the cross themselves were symbols loaded with meaning. The rose represented secrecy, unfolding knowledge, and hidden lineage. The cross represented suffering, transformation, and continuity through sacrifice. Together, they formed a language that could be read only by those who already knew how. Francis Bacon's writings are saturated with this symbolic density. He spoke openly about the need for a great instauration, a complete renewal of knowledge and society. But he also warned that such renewal could not occur openly within Europe's rigid structures. Something new was needed, a fresh beginning. This is where the New World takes on an entirely different significance. To most Europeans, the Americas represented opportunity, land, wealth, power. But to those thinking in symbolic and esoteric terms, the New World represented escape. Not escape from poverty or persecution alone, but escape from memory. A place unburdened by centuries of dogma, hierarchy, and inherited authority. Bacon wrote of ideal societies, of hidden colleges, of communities founded on wisdom rather than domination. His utopian vision, often dismissed as philosophical fiction, aligns uncannily with the idea of transplanting a sacred continuity into a land where it could evolve without interference. Some alternative traditions go further, suggesting that Bacon was not merely imagining such a future, but actively planning for it. That encoded within his works are references to voyages, settlements, and a long-term project to seed the new world with individuals aligned not by nationality, but by shared understanding. Whether literal or symbolic, the implication is striking. If the sacred line had survived Europe by dispersal, the New World offered something unprecedented, convergence without persecution. A place where different branches could merge again, not under a banner or crown, but through shared purpose. The Rosicrucian ideal fits perfectly within this framework. Invisible influence, gradual transformation, progress without proclamation, the guardianship of knowledge rather than territory. And once again, secrecy was essential. The transition from Europe to the Americas could not appear deliberate. It had to look accidental, economic, or religious. Colonization provided the perfect cover. Ships crossed the Atlantic filled with settlers, merchants, soldiers, and missionaries. Among them, hidden in plain sight, were individuals carrying fragments of older traditions, philosophical, symbolic, and perhaps even genealogical. These individuals did not announce themselves as heirs to anything. They blended. They adapted. They observed. The New World, unlike Europe, did not yet possess entrenched institutions strong enough to suppress alternative continuities. Indigenous societies had their own sacred lineages, their own cosmologies, their own understanding of blood, land, and memory. In this convergence, something unexpected became possible. Instead of domination alone, there could be merging. This possibility would have been unthinkable in Europe, where sacred authority was fiercely guarded. But in the Americas, where worlds were colliding and identities were unstable, continuity could change form without disappearing. Bacon's vision, whether intentionally enacted or symbolically expressed, reflects this shift. He did not imagine a new empire. He imagined a new foundation, a quiet rerouting of wisdom in unfamiliar soil. The Rosicrucians, too, emphasize the idea of working unseen, of allowing history to believe it is moving in one direction while something deeper unfolds beneath. This philosophy mirrors the survival strategy of the Grail lineage across centuries. Never confront power directly, but outlast it. By the early 17th century, Europe stood on the brink of transformation. Science challenged theology. Exploration shattered old maps. Authority fractured. And in the midst of this upheaval, the sacred line faced a choice it had faced many times before: remain and risk extinction, or move and transform. The New World was not merely a destination. It was an experiment in whether continuity could survive without recognition, whether sacred inheritance could merge with unfamiliar bloodlines, whether meaning could persist without memory. And somewhere in this experiment, names would change. Stories would be rewritten. Individuals would become symbols rather than people. The guardianship that once belonged to knights now belonged to ideas. And ideas, unlike institutions, cannot be destroyed. As ships continued to cross the Atlantic, they carried more than supplies and settlers. They carried fragments of an ancient strategy: survival through adaptation, preservation through silence, and transformation through convergence. The stage was set. The sacred line had escaped Europe not by fleeing it, but by dissolving into the future. When Jamestown was founded in 1607, it entered history as a fragile colonial outpost, a struggling settlement plagued by hunger, disease, and internal conflict. Textbooks describe it as a desperate gamble by the English crown, driven by economic ambition and imperial rivalry. And on the surface, this explanation appears sufficient. Jamestown failed repeatedly before it survived. Its early years were marked by chaos, not control. Yet history often hides its most deliberate designs behind the appearance of disorder. Because when Jamestown is viewed through the lens of hidden continuity rather than colonial failure, it begins to look less like a reckless venture and more like an experiment. Not an economic one alone, not merely a political one, but something quieter and far more ambitious. The men who organized Jamestown were not simple adventurers. They were connected through education, patronage, and philosophy to the intellectual currents reshaping Europe. Many had ties to court politics, esoteric societies, and emerging scientific thought. They were men accustomed to thinking in long timelines, not short-term survival. The Virginia Company itself was more than a commercial enterprise. It was a private organization operating with royal approval but relative independence. Its charters granted unusual freedoms. Its goals were described vaguely enough to allow flexibility. And its leadership included individuals whose interests extended far beyond profit. Jamestown's location was carefully chosen. Not because it was ideal, it was not, but because it was defensible, isolated, and symbolically positioned. It sat at the edge of known territory between the Atlantic world and indigenous civilizations that had endured for centuries. It was a threshold. Thresholds matter in symbolic thinking. To establish something new, one does not build it at the center of existing power. One builds it at the margins, where identities are fluid and outcomes uncertain. Jamestown was not meant to succeed quickly. It was meant to survive long enough for something else to take root. The people sent there were equally revealing. Among them were gentlemen unprepared for manual labor, scholars unsuited to frontier life, and individuals whose presence made little sense in a purely practical colony. These were not pioneers. They were placeholders. John Smith, often portrayed as the colony's central figure, was himself a paradox. A soldier a writer, a survivor. His accounts are dramatic, theatrical, and carefully constructed. He understood the power of narrative. But even Smith's story leaves gaps, moments glossed over, encounters simplified, motivations obscured. And then there is the world Jamestown encountered. The Powhatan Confederacy was not a loose collection of tribes, but a sophisticated political and spiritual system. Authority flowed through lineage. Leadership was symbolic as well as practical. Kinship mattered. Blood mattered. Memory mattered. To Europeans arriving with fractured identities and uncertain futures, this indigenous worldview would have felt both alien and strangely familiar, especially to those carrying older ideas of sacred continuity beneath layers of European disguise. Interactions between Jamestown settlers and the Powhatan were not merely diplomatic or hostile. They were ritualized. Exchanges of gifts, symbols, and individuals carried meanings that extended beyond immediate survival. Adoption, naming, and incorporation were practices deeply embedded in indigenous societies, practices Europeans often misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented. In this environment, Jamestown became something more than a colony. It became a point of convergence. European settlers brought with them fractured traditions, hidden lineages, and symbolic frameworks seeking new ground. Indigenous societies brought ancient understandings of land, ancestry, and sacred inheritance. Where these worlds met, something unpredictable emerged. The early instability of Jamestown may have served a purpose. Chaos creates cover. Failure discourages scrutiny. A colony perceived as weak attracts less attention from centralized power. While Europe watched Jamestown struggle, something else unfolded quietly beneath that struggle. It is no coincidence that secrecy, coded communication, and symbolic thinking thrived in colonial correspondence. Letters spoke in economic terms while hinting at broader goals. Failures were exaggerated. Successes were downplayed. Information was managed carefully. To an outside observer, Jamestown looked unimportant. But unimportance is often the safest disguise. The land itself played a role. The New World was not burdened by European memory. Old symbols could be repurposed. New meanings could be assigned. Identity could be reshaped without constant reference to ancestry or doctrine. This freedom was unprecedented. Jamestown did not need to become powerful. It needed to become permanent. Survival was success. Everything else could unfold slowly across generations. This long view aligns perfectly with the survival strategy of the sacred line. Never rush. Never dominate. Endure. Within Jamestown's fragile walls, alliances formed not just for trade or defense, but for integration. Europeans learned indigenous languages. Indigenous leaders engaged with European customs. Boundaries blurred, and in this blurring, lineage could transform. To those thinking symbolically, Jamestown represented a laboratory, not in the scientific sense, but in the alchemical one, a place where old elements were broken down so something new could be formed, where identity dissolved before recombining. Alchemy, after all, was never about turning lead into gold. It was about transformation through dissolution. The suffering, starvation, and death that marked Jamestown's early years were real. But suffering does not negate intention. Often it masks it. Large designs rarely spare individuals. History remembers outcomes, not costs. As Jamestown stabilized, it began to fade into normalcy. Crops replaced chaos. Governance replaced improvisation. And with stability came invisibility. The experiment no longer drew attention. This is where individuals begin to matter more than institutions. The stage was set for symbolic figures to emerge, individuals whose lives would be simplified into stories, whose deeper significance would be hidden beneath narrative convenience. People who stood between worlds, carrying meanings they themselves may never have fully understood. Jamestown did not need to announce its purpose. It needed only to exist long enough for convergence to occur. And convergence was coming. The old world had crossed the ocean, carrying fractured memories of sacred continuity. The new world held lineages untouched by European suppression. When these worlds met, something ancient recognized itself in unfamiliar form. The experiment was no longer theoretical. It was alive. Jamestown, remembered as a struggling colony, may in fact have been one of history's most successful concealments. Not because it achieved greatness quickly, but because it allowed something fragile and dangerous to survive without being noticed. In plain sight. And at the center of this convergence, history was preparing to place a symbol so powerful that her story would need to be softened, romanticized, and reduced, so that what she represented would never be questioned. Her name would be remembered, but her meaning would be forgotten. At least, that was the plan. By the time Pocahontas enters the historical record, the stage has already been carefully prepared. Jamestown exists. The old world and the new are locked in an uneasy embrace. Survival depends on diplomacy as much as force. And history, as always, is already deciding how this story will be remembered. What we are given instead is a version softened by time, simplified by repetition, and polished into something safe enough to teach to children. But Pocahontas was never meant to be safe. Her name alone tells us this. Pocahontas was not her birth name, but a nickname, a private name meaning something closer to the playful one or the curious spirit. Her real name was Matoka, and even that may not have been the name used in ritual or lineage. In many indigenous cultures, names are layered. Public names, private names, ceremonial names. Each reveals only what is necessary. From the moment she is renamed by history, something essential is already being concealed. Pocahontas was born into power. Her father, Wahunsinkaw, known to the English as Chief Powhatan, was not merely a tribal leader, but the head of a vast confederacy. His authority rested on lineage, ritual legitimacy, and spiritual continuity. Leadership was not seized. It was inherited, maintained, and symbolically reinforced. This is critical to understand. Pocahontas was not a peripheral figure wandering between worlds. She was embedded at the heart of one. Her movements, interactions, and eventual fate were never simply personal. They were political, spiritual, and symbolic. To reduce her story to a romantic gesture is not just inaccurate. It is deliberate erasure. The famous account of Pocahontas saving John Smith is a perfect example. Smith's writings are theatrical, inconsistent, and suspiciously self-serving. He was a man who understood the power of myth and was not above shaping himself into a hero. Many scholars now question whether the event occurred at all, or whether Smith misunderstood a ritual of symbolic death and rebirth, a practice common in Powhatan culture. If this was a ritual, it reframes everything. Rather than Pocahontas acting impulsively out of affection, she may have been participating in a ceremonial act, one that symbolized incorporation rather than rescue. In such a ritual, Smith would not have been spared as an individual, but transformed symbolically into something else. A guest, a dependent, a figure bound by obligation. This interpretation strips the story of romance and replaces it with something far more unsettling: intentional convergence. Pocahontas' role, then, was not that of a child moved by emotion, but of a symbolic intermediary, a living bridge between worlds, someone whose presence carried meaning beyond herself. As Jamestown struggled to survive, Pocahontas appeared repeatedly in accounts as a messenger, a negotiator, and a stabilizing presence. She brought food. She delivered warnings. She moved freely between English and Powhatan spaces, a privilege not granted lightly. This freedom suggests trust, and trust, in societies built on lineage, is never given without reason. As Pocahontas grew older, the nature of her interactions changed. The playful child of English imagination became a figure of interest, then of concern. Her capture by the English marks a turning point, not only in her life, but in the narrative surrounding her. She was no longer a bridge by choice. She became a symbol by force. Her conversion to Christianity, her renaming as Rebecca, and her marriage to John Rolfe are often framed as a story of assimilation and peace. But beneath this framing lies a deeper tension. Conversion was not merely spiritual. It was political. It redefined identity. It rewrote lineage. Marriage, too, was never neutral. John Rolfe is remembered as a tobacco farmer, a practical man whose union with Pocahontas brought stability. But his background raises questions. He was educated, connected, and closely aligned with colonial leadership. His marriage was sanctioned, celebrated, and presented to England as evidence of successful integration. But integration into what? By marrying Pocahontas, Rolfe did not simply gain a wife. He gained access, symbolic, cultural, and possibly genealogical. Their union represented not just peace, but convergence. Two lineages merging at a moment when both were under immense pressure. For Powhatan society, the marriage may have been a strategic concession, a way to preserve continuity through adaptation. For the English, it was a triumph, proof that the New World could be reshaped. And yet, the speed with which Pocahontas was removed from her homeland after the marriage is telling. Her journey to England transformed her into something else entirely. She was no longer a person. She became a display. Presented to court as proof of colonial success, she was dressed, renamed, and recontextualized. Her presence served a purpose: to reassure investors, to impress royalty, to legitimize expansion. In England, she was carefully controlled. Who she spoke to, where she appeared, how she was described. Her story was curated. This curation suggests anxiety, because Pocahontas did not fit easily into English categories. She was not a subject, not a noble, not a curiosity. She existed between definitions. And things that exist between definitions are dangerous. Her sudden death, just as she was preparing to return to Virginia, closes her story abruptly. Official accounts cite illness, but the timing has always unsettled historians. She died young, far from home, at the moment when her symbolic usefulness may have begun to wane. Her body never returned. In Powhatan culture, burial matters. Where one is laid to rest connects ancestors to land, memory, and continuity. Pocahontas' burial in English soil represents a final severing, or perhaps a final concealment. Her son, Thomas Rolfe, survived. And this is where the fairy tale ends and the lineage question begins. Thomas was raised apart from both worlds. Not fully Powhatan, not fully English. His existence alone represented convergence. Not symbolic, but biological. Blood merging across continents. Lineages once separate now joined. What became of him, and of his descendants, would quietly echo across generations. Pocahontas herself fades from history after her death, but her image does not. She becomes mythologized, romanticized, softened. Dangerous complexity is replaced with innocence. Power is replaced with passivity. This transformation is not accidental. History often does this to figures who represent convergence. It reduces them to symbols stripped of agency, because agency invites questions, and questions threaten stability. But when we step back from the fairy tale, another image emerges. Pocahontas was not merely a girl caught between worlds. She was a node, a point where multiple currents met. Indigenous lineage, European ambition, hidden continuity, symbolic necessity. Whether she understood the full weight of this role is impossible to know. Individuals rarely comprehend the forces that move through them. History does not require awareness. It requires position. And Pocahontas occupied a position history could not afford to leave unexplained, or worse, examined too closely. So her story was simplified. But simplification leaves gaps. And it is in those gaps that the deeper story waits, not as accusation, not as certainty, but as a question history has never fully answered. What exactly was being preserved, and why did it need to pass through her? By the time Pocahontas was baptized and renamed Rebecca, the transformation of her identity was already complete in the eyes of the English. Names, after all, are not just labels. They are declarations. To rename someone is to redefine their place in the world, to reshape how they are remembered, and to signal ownership over their story. Conversion was not simply a spiritual act, it was a political one. It marked the moment when Pocahontas was no longer understood as a daughter of the Powhatan world, but as a figure absorbed into an English framework of meaning. Yet this transformation was never as complete as it appeared. Christian conversion, especially in the colonial context, functioned as a kind of ritual erasure. Indigenous cosmologies were dismissed as superstition, ancestral authority was replaced by doctrine, and lineage-based identity was recast as individual belief. But beneath the surface, blood does not convert. Lineage does not dissolve because a new name is spoken over it. What conversion truly accomplished was concealment. Rebecca Rolfe was an English name placed over a Powhatan reality. The marriage between Pocahontas and John Rolfe has long been presented as a peaceful resolution to colonial conflict, a romanticized moment where two worlds supposedly reconciled through love. But history rarely moves through sentiment alone. Marriage, especially in elite or transitional societies, is a tool. It binds families, secures alliances, and stabilizes volatile power dynamics. To understand this union, one must look beyond emotion and examine context. John Rolfe was not an accidental figure in the colony. He was educated, methodical, and deeply invested in Jamestown's future. His success with tobacco did more than save the colony economically. It reshaped the destiny of English America. Tobacco turned Jamestown from a failing experiment into a profitable enterprise. And profit brings attention. Attention, in turn, requires legitimacy. By marrying Pocahontas, Rolfe did not simply form a personal bond. He participated in a symbolic act that told a carefully crafted story to England. The New World was not chaotic, hostile, or irredeemable. It could be harmonized. It could be integrated. It could be controlled. But the Powhatan perspective complicates this narrative. In societies where lineage defined authority, marriage into ruling blood was never trivial. Pocahontas was not a random daughter. She was connected to the core of Powhatan legitimacy. Her marriage carried weight whether the English understood it fully or not. To the Powhatan, this union may have represented a strategic concession, a way to preserve continuity in the face of overwhelming change. This is where the idea of a hidden union of blood becomes unavoidable. From an alternative historical perspective, this marriage represents convergence rather than assimilation. Two lineages, both under threat in different ways, intersected at a moment when survival required adaptation. The English carried fractured remnants of old European continuity. The Powhatan carried ancient indigenous lineage rooted in land and ritual. Their union did not erase one in favor of the other. It fused them, and fusion creates something new. The child born of this union, Thomas Rolfe, embodies this convergence in its purest form. He was neither fully English nor fully Powhatan. He carried blood that crossed not just cultural boundaries, but symbolic ones. Old World and New World. Suppressed lineage and unbroken ancestral continuity. Memory and adaptation. Thomas's early life reflects the discomfort his existence created. He did not grow up openly embraced by either world. After Pocahontas' death, he was separated from his Powhatan relatives and raised within English society, yet never fully integrated. His identity was inconvenient. He was living evidence that the boundary between colonizer and colonized was porous. Porous boundaries are dangerous to systems built on hierarchy. For years, Thomas lived in relative obscurity. His inheritance was uncertain, his role undefined, and yet his lineage quietly persisted. He eventually returned to Virginia, reclaimed land, and reconnected, at least partially, with his Powhatan heritage. This return is often glossed over in historical accounts, but it matters deeply because it suggests that convergence was not a one-way process. Blood moved back as well as forward. Memory resurfaced. The sacred continuity, if it existed, was not extinguished by conversion or marriage. It adapted and endured. The English narrative emphasized Pocahontas' Christianity and marriage as evidence of success. But the very need to emphasize these points reveals anxiety. If the transformation had been complete, it would not have required constant reinforcement. The repeated insistence that she had become English suggests fear that she never truly had. And perhaps she could not, because Pocahontas did not simply abandon one world for another. She was placed at the intersection of both. Her role was symbolic long before it was personal. She became a vessel, not in the sense of passivity, but in the sense of continuity. Something passed through her that history did not know how to name. Marriage, in this context, becomes less about romance and more about transfer. Transfer of legitimacy. Transfer of symbolism. Transfer of blood. This interpretation unsettles conventional history because it refuses to keep categories separate. It suggests that colonization was not only an act of domination, but also an unintended act of integration. That something ancient survived not by resisting change, but by merging with it. Conversion, too, takes on a different meaning. Rather than representing spiritual replacement, it becomes a mask, a necessary disguise in a world where survival required conformity. Beneath the outward adoption of Christian identity, deeper structures of memory and lineage could continue unchallenged. This is not to claim intention where none can be proven. It is to observe pattern where coincidence is often assumed. Throughout history, sacred lineages have survived by hiding in plain sight, by adopting the language, symbols, and customs of dominant cultures while preserving continuity beneath. Pocahontas' conversion and marriage fit this pattern too neatly to ignore. Her story was reshaped, not because it was insignificant, but because it was too significant to leave intact. The English needed her to be a success story. The Powhatan needed her to be a concession. History needed her to be simple. But blood is never simple. As generations passed, the descendants of this union blended further into colonial society. Names changed, records thinned, memory faded, yet something persisted, a lineage that defied clean categorization, rooted neither entirely in Europe nor wholly in indigenous America. If the Grail was continuity rather than object, this is precisely how it would survive. Not through monuments or declarations, but through people whose identities blurred boundaries and escaped easy classification. Pocahontas did not live long enough to see the consequences of her role, but history continued to move through her long after she was gone. Her marriage was not an ending. It was a hinge, a quiet turning point where ancient survival strategies adapted to a new world. The union of blood that occurred through her was not celebrated openly because it could not be explained safely. Instead, it was buried beneath romance, conversion, and tragedy. Yet beneath those layers, something endured. Not a kingdom, not a doctrine, but a line that had learned, once again, how to survive by becoming invisible. By the time the dust of Pocahontas' story settled, history had already moved on, or so it appeared. Jamestown stabilized, England strengthened its colonial grip, and the narrative of the New World became one of expansion, commerce, and empire. On the surface, Pocahontas faded into legend, reduced to a symbol of early contact and fragile peace. But beneath this surface calm, a far more complex question lingered quietly, unasked and largely unexamined. What exactly had crossed the Atlantic? Not ships, not weapons, not religion alone, but blood. The idea that a lineage could migrate across an ocean, not through conquest, but through convergence, challenges nearly every conventional framework of history. Yet when viewed through the patterns already established, the possibility no longer feels radical. It feels consistent. For centuries, the sacred line had survived by adapting to pressure. When kings became dangerous, it withdrew into orders. When orders were destroyed, it dissolved into families. When Europe became hostile, it dispersed. And now, in the New World, it encountered something unprecedented: indigenous bloodlines that had never been subjected to European religious erasure. This is where the transatlantic bloodline theory begins to take shape. The theory does not claim that Europeans arrived in the Americas carrying a single, intact royal lineage. Instead, it suggests that fragments of a suppressed European continuity encountered ancient indigenous lineages rooted in land, ritual, and ancestry, and that through strategic, symbolic, and biological unions, something new emerged. Not replacement, continuation. Indigenous societies across the Americas understood lineage in ways that predated Europe by millennia. Authority was not abstract. It was inherited, embodied, and maintained through ritual. Memory lived in blood, not in books. When Europeans arrived, they often misunderstood these systems, dismissing them as primitive or superstitious. But to those carrying fragments of old European sacred continuity, these systems may have felt strangely familiar. This familiarity matters, because convergence does not occur randomly. It occurs where resonance exists. The union of Pocahontas and John Rolfe is often treated as an anomaly, a rare moment of cross-cultural intimacy. But anomalies, when examined closely, often reveal patterns rather than exceptions. Their marriage was not isolated. It occurred within a broader context of alliances, negotiations, and symbolic exchanges between colonists and indigenous elites. What makes Pocahontas' case unique is not that it happened, but that it was recorded and then reshaped. Once bloodlines merge, history becomes uncomfortable. Categorization breaks down. Clear distinctions between colonizer and colonized blur. And systems built on hierarchy require clarity to survive. The transatlantic bloodline theory suggests that this discomfort led to selective memory. Certain genealogies were preserved, others were obscured. Indigenous ancestry was downplayed or erased in official records. European ancestry was emphasized or simplified. The result was a narrative that maintained separation even where integration had already occurred. Genealogical anomalies support this possibility. Across early colonial America, there are families whose origins are strangely difficult to trace. Individuals appear in records fully formed, landowners, officials, intermediaries, without clear ancestral paths. Their names are European, but their circumstances suggest something more complex. Their alliances cross boundaries too easily to be coincidental. In some cases, oral traditions preserved what written records did not. Indigenous stories speak of outsiders who were adopted rather than conquered, of lineages that merged quietly, of blood remembered long after names were forgotten. Written history often dismisses oral tradition as unreliable, but oral tradition is not meant to preserve dates. It preserves meaning, and meaning, when compared across cultures, reveals patterns that documents alone cannot. The transatlantic bloodline theory does not rest on a single document or discovery. It emerges gradually through accumulation, through repeated echoes, through questions that refuse to disappear. Why were certain indigenous elites treated differently by colonists? Why were some mixed heritage individuals granted privileges denied to others? Why do certain families reappear across generations in positions of mediation rather than domination? These questions do not accuse. They observe. One of the most telling aspects of this theory is how quickly it disappears from academic discussion. Not because it has been conclusively disproven, but because it exists in the space between disciplines. It is too genealogical for historians, too historical for geneticists, too symbolic for anthropologists, and too unsettling for institutions built on linear narratives. Yet history often hides in the margins. The idea that the Holy Grail, understood as sacred continuity, could survive by merging with indigenous lineage is deeply uncomfortable to modern sensibilities. It challenges notions of cultural purity. It undermines colonial narratives of dominance. And it suggests that power flows in directions history does not like to acknowledge. If true, even partially, it would mean that the New World was not merely shaped by Europe. Europe was transformed by the New World, not through conquest, but through blood. This is why the theory emphasizes Pocahontas not as an endpoint, but as a threshold. Her role was not to symbolize peace, but to enable convergence. Her lineage did not vanish. It diffused. Thomas Rolfe's descendants did not form a dynasty. They did something far more effective. They blended. They integrated. They became unremarkable. Unremarkable lineages survive longest. Over generations, memory faded. Indigenous identity was erased or diluted. European identity was emphasized. Records became fragmented. And what remained was ambiguity, the most effective camouflage history can offer. The transatlantic bloodline theory also explains why Grail symbolism loses its medieval form after the colonial period. It does not disappear. It transforms. The chalice becomes abstract. The quest becomes internal. The lineage becomes untraceable. This is exactly what survival requires. If the sacred line had remained visible, it would have been targeted. Instead, it learned to dissolve into populations, to exist without recognition, to carry meaning without myth. The New World provided ideal conditions for this transformation. Rapid population growth, cultural instability, poor record-keeping, constant migration. In such an environment, continuity could persist without detection. It is important to emphasize that this theory does not require conscious participation by those involved. Bloodlines do not need intention to survive. They move through history carried by ordinary lives, farmers, merchants, officials, families, people unaware of the symbolic weight they carry. History often assigns meaning after the fact. The Grail, if it survived into the Americas, did not arrive as legend. It arrived as potential. It embedded itself in a land already rich with sacred continuity. It adapted to new symbols, new rituals, new expressions. And in doing so, it fulfilled its oldest function, survival beyond institutions. This theory does not ask to be believed. It asks to be considered. Because once the possibility is acknowledged, history begins to look different. Not rewritten, but relayered. Events gain depth. Figures regain complexity. And the past becomes something living rather than settled. The transatlantic bloodline theory is unsettling not because it is dramatic, but because it is subtle. It does not shout. It whispers. And whispers, when repeated across centuries, often tell us more than declarations ever could. The question is no longer whether such a lineage could have crossed the Atlantic. The question is whether history could afford to notice if it did. When bloodlines disappear from written history, they do not vanish entirely. They change language. They abandon names and adopt symbols. They move from documents into patterns, from declarations into design. This is where history becomes quiet and where it becomes most revealing. Symbols are history's second voice. Long after genealogies fracture and records decay, symbols remain embedded in architecture, seals, emblems, rituals, and habits. They speak without words. They communicate across generations without drawing attention. And most importantly, they allow meaning to survive where explanation would be dangerous. If the sacred continuity associated with the Grail survived into the New World, it would not announce itself. It would not carve its story into monuments. It would hide in plain sight, encoded in forms that appear decorative, official, or mundane. This is precisely what we begin to see when examining early colonial symbolism. Seals used by colonial companies, governors, and settlements often contain imagery that goes far beyond administrative necessity. Classical figures, mysterious mottos, geometric arrangements, and allegorical scenes appear repeatedly, far too often to be coincidence. These images were not random. They were chosen by educated men steeped in symbolic literacy. Symbols, after all, are not invented casually. Take the frequent appearance of classical goddesses, blindfolded figures, ships guided by unseen forces, and landscapes framed as thresholds rather than destinations. These motifs echo older European esoteric traditions, particularly those associated with continuity, transition, and hidden authority. The eye that watches but does not intervene. The vessel that carries but does not own. The path that is walked but never marked. Such imagery aligns closely with the Grail, understood not as an object, but as an inheritance. Even the very concept of a seal is telling. A seal does not explain. It authenticates. It confirms legitimacy without revealing substance. It is a mark of continuity, something that remains valid even when its origin is forgotten. Colonial seals often combined Old World symbolism with New World imagery. European heraldic elements appear alongside indigenous motifs, landscapes, or references to abundance and renewal. This blending suggests not domination alone, but integration, a visual merging of worlds. Architecture tells a similar story. Early colonial buildings, particularly those associated with governance, education, and religion, frequently incorporate symbolic proportions and alignments inconsistent with purely functional design. Geometry mattered. Orientation mattered. Placement mattered. These choices reflect an older worldview, one in which space itself carried meaning. In European esoteric tradition, sacred continuity was often encoded in spatial relationships rather than explicit iconography. Buildings became texts. Cities became diagrams. Meaning was embedded in form rather than inscription. This practice did not disappear with colonization. It migrated. The New World offered a blank canvas. Old symbols could be reassembled in new configurations. The absence of entrenched oversight allowed experimentation. Structures could be built without immediate scrutiny. And once built, they became permanent, silent witnesses to intention long forgotten. Beyond architecture and seals, there are patterns in names. Place names in early America often defy simple explanation. Classical references appear in unexpected locations. Biblical names coexist with indigenous terms. Some names seem aspirational rather than descriptive, evoking ideals rather than geography. Naming, like renaming, is never neutral. A name anchors memory. It directs interpretation. And when layered carefully, it allows multiple meanings to coexist, one visible, one concealed. Personal names follow similar patterns. Certain families reuse specific names across generations with unusual consistency. These names often carried symbolic weight rather than familial necessity. They echoed older European traditions where names functioned as markers of continuity rather than individuality. Such practices make sense only if memory mattered more than documentation. Perhaps the most compelling silent testimonies come from ritual behavior. Colonial societies developed customs that seemed oddly disconnected from their stated beliefs. Ceremonies stripped of theological explanation persisted long after their original meanings were forgotten. Oaths emphasized secrecy. Initiations stressed silence and restraint. Knowledge was framed as something earned gradually rather than given freely. These behaviors echo the guardianship model seen repeatedly throughout this story. Guardians do not proclaim. They preserve. One of the most misunderstood aspects of symbolic continuity is that it does not require universal understanding. Symbols are not meant for everyone. They are meant for recognition, a signal to those who already know how to see. This is why symbolic systems often appear contradictory or meaningless to outsiders. They are not puzzles meant to be solved. They are confirmations meant to be recognized. When examining colonial-era artifacts, seals, documents, emblems, architecture, one finds repeated references to renewal, rebirth, hidden order, and unseen guidance. These themes align closely with Baconian and Rosicrucian thought, which itself drew from much older traditions of concealed continuity. The language changed, but the message remained. It is also important to note what is absent. There is a remarkable lack of explicit celebration of lineage in early American symbolism. Unlike European monarchies, where bloodlines were openly proclaimed, colonial imagery emphasizes ideals, liberty, providence, destiny, rather than ancestry. This absence may not reflect ignorance of lineage, but avoidance of it. A sacred continuity that survived by becoming invisible would not suddenly reveal itself in a land where visibility could invite destruction. Instead, it would express itself abstractly, as principle rather than pedigree. Even indigenous symbols were selectively incorporated, not as representations of living cultures, but as stylized motifs stripped of immediate context. This abstraction allowed indigenous continuity to be acknowledged symbolically while neutralizing its political power. And yet, fragments remained. Oral traditions persisted alongside written ones. Families passed down stories that did not align neatly with official narratives. Ancestry was remembered quietly, selectively, and often only within private spaces. Silence became inheritance. Over time, these silent testimonies accumulated. No single symbol proves anything. No single seal reveals intent. But together, they form a pattern, one consistent with survival through concealment rather than disappearance. Modern historians often dismiss such patterns as coincidence or overinterpretation. But coincidence rarely produces coherence. Patterns do. The most effective concealments are not those that erase evidence, but those that flood it with ambiguity. When everything appears symbolic, nothing appears definitive. And definitive claims are what institutions fear least. Ambiguity protects continuity. If the Grail survived into the modern world, it would do so not as legend, but as structure, as behavior, as instinct, as preference for silence over proclamation. This helps explain why modern discussions of Grail lineage feel perpetually unresolved. Evidence appears and disappears. Connections suggest themselves and then dissolve. Certainty remains just out of reach. This is not failure. It is design. Symbols were never meant to explain history. They were meant to carry it forward intact. And as long as those symbols remain, embedded in seals, architecture, rituals, and memory, the story they protect remains alive, waiting for those patient enough to listen. The Grail, if it exists at all, does not announce itself. It watches. It endures. And it leaves its testimony not in words, but in forms so familiar that they are rarely questioned, which is precisely why they have survived. By the time symbols replace stories and whispers replace records, a different kind of power has already taken hold. This power does not rule through force or decree. It rules through absence, through omission, through the quiet agreement that certain questions will not be asked too loudly, and certain connections will not be followed too far. This is the power of institutions, not merely to preserve history, but to shape the boundaries of what history is allowed to be. Institutions do not need to lie to control memory. They only need to decide what matters. Once a narrative becomes official, everything outside it is relegated to the margins. Alternative interpretations are labeled speculative. Oral traditions are called unreliable. Symbolic readings are dismissed as imaginative. Over time, repetition hardens opinion, and opinion becomes fact. This process is so subtle that it rarely feels like suppression. It feels like common sense. This is how silence is manufactured. The story of the Grail, when framed as bloodline rather than object, presents a fundamental problem for institutional authority. It suggests continuity independent of church, crown, or state. It implies that legitimacy can survive outside sanction structures. And perhaps most dangerously, it challenges the idea that history moves only through officially recognized channels. For institutions built on control, this idea is intolerable. Throughout history, whenever lineage-based authority threatened centralized power, it was neutralized not by debate, but by reframing. Sacred blood became myth. Living continuity became legend. And legend, once stripped of urgency, became entertainment. This pattern is visible everywhere. The Merovingians were reduced to footnotes. The Templars were remembered as greedy bankers or heretics. Mary Magdalene was rewritten as a repentant sinner. Pocahontas was transformed into a romantic symbol. Each figure lost complexity. Each lost agency. And with that loss, the deeper implications of their existence were safely buried. Institutions prefer clean stories. Clean stories do not destabilize. Universities, churches, governments, and cultural bodies function by consensus. They reward conformity not because dissent is always wrong, but because dissent is unpredictable. Alternative histories introduce variables that cannot be controlled. They open doors to reinterpretation, and reinterpretation threatens authority. This does not require conspiracy. It requires inertia. Once a narrative becomes embedded in curricula, museums, and public memory, questioning it becomes socially costly. Scholars risk credibility. Educators risk funding. Institutions risk legitimacy. Silence becomes the safer option. Over time, silence becomes tradition. Consider how often alternative interpretations are dismissed with a single word: speculative. That word does not refute. It ends discussion. It signals that curiosity has crossed an invisible line. Yet history itself is speculative by nature. Every reconstruction relies on interpretation. Every archive is incomplete. Every narrative is shaped by what survived and what did not. The difference lies not in certainty, but in permission. Some questions are permitted, others are not. The transatlantic bloodline theory exists precisely in this forbidden space. It does not fit neatly into existing categories. It cannot be proven conclusively, but neither can it be dismissed without addressing the patterns it reveals. And so, it is easier to ignore. Institutions excel at ignoring. There's also the question of modern identity. Nations are built on stories. The story of America, in particular, relies heavily on themes of rupture and replacement, a new world breaking from the old, a clean beginning, a fresh start. The idea that ancient European sacred continuity merged with indigenous lineage complicates this story. It suggests continuity where rupture is preferred, integration where dominance is emphasized, mutual transformation rather than one-sided conquest. Such ideas destabilize national mythologies. They also raise uncomfortable ethical questions. If convergence occurred, then the story of colonization becomes more complex than oppressor and oppressed. It becomes a story of survival strategies colliding under immense pressure, some violent, some adaptive, some hidden. Complexity is dangerous to institutions because it resists simplification. Silence, therefore, is not always enforced aggressively. Often, it is encouraged through tone, through academic language that signals disapproval without explanation, through funding priorities, through publication standards, through peer review systems that favor familiar frameworks. Over time, entire fields learn what not to pursue. This silence is particularly heavy around genealogy and bloodline studies. Modern discomfort with concepts of lineage, inheritance, and sacred ancestry makes such discussions socially radioactive. Fears of misuse, nationalism, and exclusion lead institutions to avoid the topic altogether. Yet avoidance does not erase reality. It only ensures that exploration occurs elsewhere, in fringe spaces, independent research, and oral memory. This, in turn, allows institutions to dismiss the entire subject as unworthy of attention. A perfect feedback loop. The irony is that suppression often preserves what it seeks to eliminate. By refusing to engage seriously, institutions allow alternative interpretations to persist unchallenged, evolving in parallel. The silence becomes evidence to those already inclined to question, and so the whisper grows. There is also the psychological dimension of suppression. Humans are uncomfortable with uncertainty. Institutions offer stability. They provide frameworks that make the past feel manageable. Alternative histories reopen questions thought settled. They destabilize identity. To question history is to question oneself. This is why resistance to alternative narratives is often emotional rather than rational. It feels like an attack on shared reality. Institutions, as guardians of shared reality, respond defensively. Yet history is not static. It is layered. What is remembered loudly is not always what mattered most. What survives quietly often shapes the future in ways that declarations cannot. The Grail tradition, interpreted as bloodline continuity, has survived precisely because it avoided institutional capture. It remained mobile, adaptable, unofficial. It learned that power announced is power targeted. Institutions announce. Lineages endure. Pocahontas' story illustrates this perfectly. Her image is everywhere. Her complexity is nowhere. Institutions preserved her symbol while erasing her significance. In doing so, they ensured her story could be consumed without consequence. But symbols, once stripped of meaning, do not die. They wait. The weight of institutional silence is heavy, but it is not absolute. Cracks form. New methodologies emerge. DNA studies complicate genealogies. Interdisciplinary research blurs boundaries. Oral traditions gain renewed respect. Questions once dismissed return with new language. Silence cannot last forever. What it can do is delay. And delay has been the sacred line's ally as much as its enemy. Every generation that passes without recognition is another generation of survival. Every omission buys time. Perhaps this is why the story feels unresolved. Why evidence seems always just out of reach. Why certainty dissolves the closer one looks. Suppression does not eliminate truth. It changes its form. Instead of monuments, there are patterns. Instead of proclamations, there are convergences. Instead of records, there are silences too consistent to ignore. Institutions may never acknowledge such a lineage openly. They do not need to. Their role has never been to reveal everything, but to maintain order. And order requires boundaries. But history does not belong to institutions alone. It belongs to those willing to listen between the lines. The weight of suppression is real, but so is the persistence of what it tries to bury. Silence is not emptiness. It is a space where memory waits. And sometimes, what waits the longest proves to be the hardest to erase. As the centuries passed and the new world transformed into the modern world, the sacred line, if it survived at all, would have done so in its most effective form yet: anonymity. No banners, no titles, no claims, just people living ordinary lives, carrying something extraordinary without knowing its shape or origin. This is where the story becomes most uncomfortable, not because it demands belief, but because it dissolves distance. It suggests that the past is not finished with us. It suggests that history may still be breathing. Modernity prides itself on separation. We divide past from present, myth from fact, ancestry from identity. We tell ourselves that bloodlines no longer matter, that history's power structures have dissolved into institutions and laws. Yet this confidence may itself be a kind of blindness, because lineage does not require belief to function. It only requires continuity. If a transatlantic sacred lineage endured, it would not announce itself in the modern age. It would not form secret kingdoms or issue proclamations. It would do what it has always done best: blend. Modern society, with its mass migration, record fragmentation, and cultural fluidity, provides the perfect environment for such survival. Identity becomes flexible. Ancestry becomes optional. Memory becomes abstract. And abstraction is camouflage. Genealogical research occasionally stumbles into this discomfort. Family trees reach dead ends where records vanish without explanation. Names change abruptly. Locations shift unexpectedly. Oral traditions contradict official documents. Indigenous ancestry appears and disappears, depending on who is telling the story and why. DNA testing, often imagined as a final authority, has only complicated matters further. Genetic markers tell stories without narratives. They reveal mixture without explanation. They confirm convergence, but refuse to assign meaning. A person may discover indigenous ancestry where none was recorded, or European lineage where none was expected. The data unsettles tidy histories. But data alone does not frighten institutions. Interpretation does. The uncomfortable question is not whether descendants exist, but what it would mean if they did. Not symbolically, but culturally. It would mean that sacred continuity is not confined to museums or myths. It would mean that the Grail, understood as living inheritance, never vanished. It simply adapted to modern invisibility. This possibility challenges deeply held assumptions. We prefer to believe that sacred authority is either institutional or extinct, either controlled or imaginary. A lineage that survives outside these categories resists both reverence and dismissal. It cannot be easily honored or easily destroyed. Modern descendants, if they exist, would not be special in any outward sense. They would not possess secret knowledge by birth. Blood does not grant awareness. It grants potential. Meaning emerges through circumstance, not certainty. This is perhaps the most unsettling idea of all, that extraordinary history could pass through ordinary lives without recognition. That significance does not announce itself. That the sacred can exist without ceremony. Throughout history, lineages that survived longest were those that avoided distinction. Nobility attracts attention. Attention attracts threat. Survival favors those who appear unimportant. In the modern world, where visibility is currency and exposure is constant, invisibility becomes power. This reframes how we think about inheritance. Instead of imagining descendants as heirs to authority, we might imagine them as custodians of balance. Not rulers, but carriers. Not leaders, but bridges. People whose lives intersect cultures, disciplines, and identities without fully belonging to any single one. Patterns begin to emerge when viewed this way. Why do certain families repeatedly occupy roles of mediation rather than domination? Why do some individuals seem drawn to boundary spaces between cultures, belief systems, or social categories? Why does convergence appear again and again in places where lineage is least discussed? These are not proofs. They're signals. The discomfort intensifies when we consider how modern power operates. Influence today is less about lineage and more about systems, finance, technology, information. Its systems are built by people, and people carry histories, whether acknowledged or not. If sacred continuity adapted to survive institutions, it may now exist within them, not controlling them, but shaping them indirectly, not through command, but through presence. This idea does not require conspiracy. It requires patience. Bloodlines do not need coordination to persist. They move through chance, attraction, repetition. Certain traits, resilience, adaptability, preference for silence, reproduce culturally as much as biologically. Over generations, patterns stabilize. Modern descendants may never trace their ancestry to Pocahontas or Europe or any Grail tradition. They may never ask. They may never know. And that ignorance may be the very thing that protects continuity. Knowledge attracts interference. Throughout this story, awareness has always been the exception, not the rule. Mary Magdalene's role was rewritten. Merovingian kings were displaced. Templars were destroyed. Pocahontas was mythologized. Survival followed concealment every time. Why would the modern era be any different? The most uncomfortable questions, then, are not genealogical. They are philosophical. What if sacred history did not end, but dissolved into the present? What if meaning survives not through memory, but through behavior? What if lineage matters not because of power, but because of responsibility? Modern culture often rejects the idea of inherited responsibility. We prefer individualism, choice, reinvention. Yet even these values emerge from specific historical currents. They did not arise spontaneously. Perhaps continuity does not contradict freedom. Perhaps it enables it. If a sacred line exists today, it may express itself not through authority, but through resistance to authority. Not through dominance, but through refusal. Refusal to simplify. Refusal to conform completely. Refusal to erase complexity. Such individuals would not stand out dramatically. They would feel slightly out of place, slightly misaligned with dominant narratives, drawn to questions rather than answers. History tends to pathologize such people or romanticize them, depending on convenience. Rarely does it recognize them as carriers of continuity. The idea that modern elites might unknowingly carry fragments of this lineage is particularly provocative. not because it suggests superiority, but because it suggests irony, power without awareness, influence without intention, meaning divorced from memory. But it is equally possible that the lineage survives most strongly among those far from power, among those whose stories were never recorded, among families whose histories were erased or dismissed. Sacred continuity has never favored the center. It favors margins, thresholds, places where worlds overlap. In the modern age, those thresholds are everywhere. Migration, hybrid identities, cultural fusion. These are not anomalies. They are the dominant condition of our time. Perhaps this is not coincidence. Perhaps the survival of the sacred line required a world where mixture is normal, where purity is impossible, and where identity is fluid. A world where bloodlines can persist without becoming symbols of exclusion. This does not make the present special. It makes it prepared. The discomfort we feel when confronting these questions may be the most honest response. Not fear, not belief, but unease. Unease suggests proximity. It suggests that the question touches something real. History feels safe when it is distant. It becomes dangerous when it feels personal. Modern descendants, if they exist, do not threaten history. They threaten closure. They remind us that the past is not finished, that meaning does not expire, and that some stories survive not by being told, but by being lived. Whether one accepts this possibility or not is less important than recognizing what it reveals about how we think, about what we are willing to consider, about what we instinctively reject. Because history is not only what happened, it is what we allow to remain possible. And sometimes, the most uncomfortable questions are the ones that refuse to stay buried. Not because they demand answers, but because they remind us that continuity does not ask for permission. It simply endures. At this point in the story, something important becomes clear. The Holy Grail has never behaved like an object. Objects can be stolen, broken, displayed, or lost. They leave clear trails in history, inventories, wars, thefts, recoveries. But the Grail we have been following leaves none of these traces. Instead, it moves like an idea. It disappears when pursued too aggressively and reappears where no one thinks to look. It survives destruction by changing shape. And most unsettling of all, it refuses to stay in the past. This is the moment where the story reaches its quiet climax. Because the ultimate revelation is not a hidden document, a secret family tree, or a lost artifact. It is a realization. The Grail was never meant to be found. It was meant to endure. When medieval storytellers described knights who failed to grasp the Grail, even when standing before it, they were not describing unworthiness in a moral sense. They were describing misunderstanding. Those knights were looking for something external, a cup, a relic, a prize. But the Grail was not external. It was continuity itself, misunderstood by those who sought possession instead of recognition. Seen this way, the entire Grail tradition becomes coherent. The Grail heals because continuity heals. It grants life because lineage persists. It vanishes because bloodlines do not announce themselves. The Grail does not reward conquest. It survives restraint. This reframing explains why the Grail consistently appears at moments of collapse. It emerges when old systems fail, when authority fractures, when meaning is threatened. And then it retreats again, carried forward not by institutions, but by people, often those standing at the margins of power. Mary Magdalene did not rule. She carried memory. The Merovingians ruled briefly, then vanished. The Templars guarded, then dissolved. Pocahontas converged worlds, then was erased. Each figure represents a phase of adaptation. By the time the Grail reaches the New World, it no longer resembles anything medieval. It has shed its armor, its castles, its rituals. What remains is essence, the survival of sacred continuity through transformation. This is why Pocahontas occupies such a powerful symbolic position in this story. She is not the Grail because of status, holiness, or intention. She is the Grail because she embodies transition. She stands at the precise moment when continuity required a new form. The old world could no longer protect it. The new world had not yet defined itself. Between these worlds, Pocahontas became a vessel, not passive, but pivotal. Her body became a meeting place of histories. Her life became a hinge between eras. Her erasure became a necessity for survival. History softened her story because it could not afford to examine it too closely. She was turned into a fairy tale because fairy tales do not destabilize power. Living symbols do. The Grail as an idea does not belong to Europe or America. It does not belong to Christianity or indigenous cosmology. It exists wherever continuity survives disruption, wherever memory adapts instead of disappearing.